Great, I see people can hear me. So let's get started. Welcome everyone to our Nonprofit Commons Dickens Project 2023 tour. And this year, we're going to be digging into some research projects. And the project for today is Dickens and Disabilities. Gentle Heron has done research on the attitudes toward disabilities in the Victorian era and in the literature of Charles Dickens. So we'll be using a combination of both voice and text. And we're going to begin at the landing point of the Dickens project. So I'm going to grab that landmark and share it with you all, but don't head out yet. Just hang on to this landmark so that you'll have it for the rest of the month, as the Dickens project is only here for the holidays. It's called the Dickens Project 2023 edition. That's the main landing point. Now, Victorian attire is optional, and there are free outfits at the Old Curiosity Shop by Dawn Greymist. I'm wearing an outfit. My Victorian attire is by Zinnia here, and I'll just share where I got it. So we're going to all stand up, and I will put the slurl in the local chat. I'll stand now. But when we get there, you will be inside the main landing point, and we'll just stand there for a few minutes and gather there, and then we'll find the portal to the Community Virtual Library Research Warehouse. So everybody stand up, and I will meet you there. Look beneath your feet. You'll see you're standing on a map that shows many of the main event areas for this year's Dickens Project. In fact, the calendar for all the Dickens Project events is right here. I'll put it in the local chat. You can also find the calendar of events on our Virtual Worlds Education Consortium Collaborative Calendars tab right on the website vweconsortium.org. You can look around this room and you'll see the portals to the various areas of the Dickens Project. I'm going to walk over to the large red arrow. I'll walk around this way rather than bump into the crowd. You'll see there's a red arrow right on the floor and a sign that says, today, Friday, December 15th, the Community Virtual Library hosts the Nonprofit Commons topic, Dickens and Disabilities with Gentle Heron. This red arrow points to the portal to the research center. Who's brave enough to go first? Just walk right up to the red arrow and walk through the portal, and we'll all gather there at the CVL Research Center. Great, people are moving towards the research center, and that's where we will begin with Gentle Heron on the topic of Dickens and disabilities. Just turn towards the right and you will see Zinnia's already found it. And Dagmar is here. She's a wonderful hostess for the Dickens Project and gives us all kinds of behind-the-scenes support. So walk in and find yourself a chair. Be sure to take off your AO if you're wearing one, as it might make sitting a little bit more difficult. I'll ask Gentle Heron to come up here and sit up front with me as we get ready to start. And the rest of you can choose a participant audience seat. And then whenever you're ready, Gentle Heron, I'll pass the mic to you.
So I want to welcome everybody, say good morning. Today I'm going to share with you some information about disability in Dickens literature and time, focusing on how he reflects and comments on the Victorian era's ambivalent attitudes toward disability. At the end of my presentation, I warn you, there will be a little quiz, so please stay alert. And I'm guessing that maybe having text as well as voice is going to help you. Lori Vaughton likes that. Dickens included many characters, of course, with a wide range of disabilities in his fiction. Sometimes he was portraying them very realistically, but at other times he was using those characters just as a caricature. Overall, Victorians were uncomfortable both with the idea and with the reality of disability, and their mixed feelings showed in their ambivalence. So let's look a bit first at Dickens' life to gain some background understanding of the characters in his stories. I hope you can see these pictures. Dickens grew up in poverty. His father and mother and all their younger children were put in debtor's prison when Dickens was 12, and that left Dickens on his own at the age of 12. And Dickens used that prison as a setting in Little Dorrit. To pay for his room and board, and to attempt to help his family get out of debtor's prison, Dickens worked 10 hours a day in a factory pasting labels on pots of boot blacking. There he earned 6 shillings a week while working under harsh, strenuous conditions. And this gave Dickens a good understanding of poverty, and it led to his adult interest in labor and socioeconomic reform. One reviewer actually said, "The phantoms of Dickens' troubled childhood haunted his prose." I kind of liked that quote. Dickens also endured the effects of a number of disabling conditions and illnesses, including gout, gonorrhea, PTSD from surviving a horrific train wreck, obsessive compulsive disorder, childhood epilepsy, and extremely painful trigeminal neuralgia. Many of these were diagnosed from his correspondence with friends that described his symptoms. You can see that his health declined and he aged rapidly if you compare portraits of him in his 20s to those done toward the end of his life at age 58. Dickens was friends with a number of notable physicians and social reformers of his time, which contributed to his personal education on the topics of poverty and disability. He was really sympathetic to the needs of the poor, the ill, and the disabled, and you can see that in his writings. So now let's look at some of Dickens' characters. Victorians in general feared disability and people who were disabled. Persons whose condition left them with disfigurements were actually seen as monsters. Dickens and other writers often portrayed such individuals as morally depraved villains. And 2 examples here with pictures from that time period, and there were a number of these engravings made that I'll show you. This is Schoolmaster Quilp from the Old Curiosity Shop, and Squeers in Nicholas Nickleby. And I just think those Victorian Dickensian names are incredible. Squeers had one eye, and people thought that was suspicious. Quilp was a dwarf, and dwarfs were often a classical way to portray a villain who had less than a full moral character. The physical deformities of these corrupt victimizers were shown to be the outward appearances of their inner depravities. Late developing disabilities in adults and older people was sometimes viewed in Victorian times as divine retribution for sin. And here we have a picture of Mrs. Skewton and Paul Dombey. They were both in Dombey and Son. And both of them are described as traveling in bath chairs. Those were, I guess, the Victorian equivalent of wheelchairs. And these 2 characters are actually in contrast with each other. Paul is actually ill, and he is portrayed very sympathetically by Dickens. However, Mrs. Skewton is using her bath chair to create an illusion of social status and wealth. She's constantly mistreating the poor man who has to push her bath chair. Dickens shows her all globbed up with makeup and in fancy clothing, and she's definitely a figure of falseness. And then Mrs. Skewton's pretense of disability and her really awful mistreatment of her chairman lead to her terminal illness. And that's when she becomes truly dependent on the chair and on the assistance of other people. The wheeled chair is a metaphor for her character's imprisonment. Her eventual disability would have been viewed as a form of retributive justice. Now we come to some more familiar characters. The Victorians also pitied those who were lesser due to their disability. Tiny Tim, of course, is stereotypically pure and spiritual. He's looked at as a helpless innocent, and so is Blind Bertha, if you've read Cricket on the Hearth. And these young characters were seen as inspirational, but they were also passively objectified. Jenny Wren and Silas Wegg illustrate these two contrasting views of disability. Jenny was charitably viewed as being one of the deserving poor, and you'll see that language in other literature from the Victorian age. And that was because she contributed to society by making doll clothes. Dickens actually wrote her up as pretty much a three-dimensional character. And in the story, she's able to overcome both physical and social adversity. And for Jenny, there were actually compensations for being disabled. That's another odd character that people from the Victorian area believed in. Dickens told us that Jenny's ability to imagine flowers was, quote, given to the child in compensation for her losses. And to help Jenny deal with the physical and emotional pain of her disability, her birds actually sing better than other birds, and her flowers smell better than other flowers. So that's compensation. On the other hand, we have Silas Wegg in Our Mutual Friend, and he was portrayed as both a shirker and a hustler. He not only had a wooden peg leg, but he was also depicted as wooden in his overall appearance and his actions. He was deformed in his character as well as in his body. Dickens used Wegg to explore the way the material culture of his time provoked greediness. He was definitely a greedy character. And, of course, Dickens also was noted for the social criticism in his stories. He used his characters' disabilities to symbolize the broken social system of his time. On the left, we see Smallweed and his wife, who are from the Bleak House story. The woman standing on the left is the maid. And on the right, we see Smike, who was in Nicholas Nickleby. And the Smallweeds and Smike were used in this way. Grandfather Smallweed was deaf and paralyzed, but he was also greedy and ruthless. In contrast, his wife's actions demonstrated characteristics of senility. Smike is a severely disabled boy. He's often described as feeble-minded and frail. But his disabilities may have actually come from the abuse he suffered rather than from a genetic origin or a disease. This is one of my favorite pictures. This was in Our Mutual Friend. This is Jenny Wren, and Jenny Wren showed Dickens' unusual attitude toward the desexualization of people with disabilities that was very prevalent in Victorian times and still actually quite prevalent. Jenny is a positive character throughout that story, and she actually ends up with Sloppy proposing marriage to her. This probably came more as a surprise to present-day readers, many of whom hold that same sexual prejudice about people with disabilities as the Victorians did. It probably came as a surprise more to them than it did to Dickens' contemporaries, because Victorians considered women's hair as a sexual exhibition. And Sloppy is attracted not only to Jenny's artistry and her lovely singing, but also to her abundant, flowing hair. I thought this was kind of funny. Persons weren't the only things in Dickens' writings which were disabled. There was the house of the Clennams in Little Dorrit. The building is described as appearing to lean on some half-dozen gigantic crutches, and you can see those in this etching, which shows the long poles that were propping up the sagging wall. And inside that old house was a maimed table and a crippled wardrobe. And the whole thing eventually collapses. I'm fairly sure that was a social commentary on the infrastructure that the poor must deal with. So, are you ready? It's time for the quiz. There are going to be 6 questions. I'd like you to please write your answers on a note card. So get out a note card. I'll help you score your quiz when we're done with all the questions. I'm going to go through all 6 questions and then go through the answers. You could use a Physical World pen and pencil on paper if you'd like. That's fine. That's easier for you. But please keep your answers to yourself until we're done. We ready, everybody? Take a deep breath. It's just a quiz. Good. Namara's ready. All 6 of these questions are going to be descriptions of Dickens' characters in his own words, and they all are characters with disabilities. Your task is to diagnose the cause of each disability. So let's begin. The first character on our quiz is Mr. Crook. You gotta give Dickens credit for oh, thank you, Rhiannon. The names here are just amazing. Mr. Crook is the owner and proprietor of a rag and bone shop. He's in the story Bleak House. And this is how Dickens describes him. This is a quote. He can make all the letters separately, and he knows most of them separately when he sees them, but he can't put them together. So what disabling conditions was Dickens describing that Mr. Crook has? We'll pause a little bit for you to write that down on your note card. You all got that one? You ready to go on? You can just type a Y if you're done, if you figured it out. Yeah, I think a lot of our educators figured that one out. So our next character is Bradley Headstone. He's the schoolmaster in Our Mutual Friend, and he suffered from what Dickens and other Victorians would have called fits. One of those episodes was actually witnessed by other people. You can see that in the drawing here. And when he was questioned about it, Mr. Headstone said, "It's not much, sir. It will pass over very soon. I am accustomed to being seized with giddiness. Now, giddiness is not a diagnosis. It's more like a symptom. So what disability do you think Mr. Headstone, the schoolmaster, had? We'll pause again. You can just tell me when you're done, just put a Y. Some of you guys are doing pretty well. And since nobody will see your answers, if you don't know, you can put don't know. Third question. This is Uriah Heep, and he was in David Copperfield. And Dickens described him as having a way of writhing when he wanted to express enthusiasm, which was very ugly. The enthusiasm wasn't ugly, it was the writhing that was ugly. And Miss Trotwood said to Uriah Heep, "If you're an eel, sir, conduct yourself like one. If you're a man, control your limbs, sir. Good God." What physical world disability was Uriah Heep portraying? We'll pause again. Thank you, Marley. Thank you, Shiloh. Miss Trotwood was rather forward with her complaint. Okay, I think we're just about done with him. And next we have a minor character, Arthur Havisham. He was in Great Expectations, and Dickens says he suffered from the horrors. Now, Dickens also said he was in a decline and was a shadow to look at. He's such a minor character, I actually couldn't find any contemporary illustration of him. There were illustrations of a lot of minor characters, but not of Havisham. So I put up a portrayal of his disability from that time period. That's not a picture of Havisham. So what was Havisham's issue with the horrors? What do you think his disability was? Shiloh got that one fast. This one may be a little harder. We don't tend to say to people, "Do you have the horrors?" Only at Halloween. And remember, you don't get points off if you don't know the answer, so it's okay to put down "don't know." So moving on to the fifth one. An old favorite, Ebenezer Scrooge. His Christmas Eve visions of past, present, and future were actually extremely vivid hallucinations. And he actually attributed them to indigestion. That's not necessarily a disability. And these were followed by a personality reversal on Christmas Day. So, what was the possible cause of Scrooge's visions and character revision? The horrors. I've heard that term ran on in World War I. Not recently, though. Maybe you guys saw the Scrooge movie that recently Lynn Lab hosted. It's pretty cool. We're ready to move on to the last of our quizzes. Okay. I started with an easy one. We should end with an easy one. Tiny Tim. He's probably the most well-known disabled character that Dickens ever wrote. Although he was cheerful, his physical condition would have been difficult both for him and for his family. He used crutches because his legs were crippled. In fact, he might die in childhood. Scrooge was warned that the future might hold an empty chair where Tiny Tim once sat. What is the likely cause of Tiny Tim's disability? That is true, Caledonia. It has been debated, but there's one of the proposed causes that seems to be the most likely. That's one of the things that people have debated about, Lisanna. You ready to score your quizzes? Rhiannon says, possibly we developed a vaccine for it. Deserving poor. That is an interesting label. And in My Fair Lady, yes. Okay. So let's find out how well you did on the quiz. Do you want to go back and see the pictures while we're going through the answers? Okay, let's go back and see these pictures. Oh. There we go, one more. Nope. Daggone it. There, Mr. Crook. So you're going to grade your own work. You don't have to admit anything to anybody. Mr. Crook was probably dyslexic, and Dickens wrote a pretty accurate description of one type of dyslexia. And what's really interesting, at least to me, I find I'm kind of geeky about disability and special education, the term dyslexia and its medical description had not yet been described in the Victorian era. It wasn't until about maybe 30, 40 years later that this was actually described as an actual disability. And I think a lot of our educators got this one. Bradley Headstone likely had epilepsy. And it was felt that Dickens had childhood epilepsy and perhaps outgrew it, but he has several characters with epilepsy. They were called Fitz, monks in Oliver Twist, Guster the maid in Bleak House. And Uriah Heep, his motions are characteristic of something called dystonia. Dystonia is an involuntary muscle contraction that causes repetitive twisting motions and contorted postures. And dystonia can actually be a feature in cerebral palsy. It can be one feature of that. Yes, Marnie. Actually, I have dystonia from multiple sclerosis. So it's fairly common. This one's probably the hard one. Havisham's condition was probably delirium tremens, we call that the DTs, brought on by chronic alcoholism. It consists of changed mental state, which is the delirium, and shivering or shaking, that's the tremens. And it's rather common during alcohol withdrawal. In Victorian times, this was known as the horrors, barrel fever, orcs, quart mania, or the bottle ache. I just love some of the terminology that was used. Scrooge may have been suffering from ergot poisoning. Yes, the mycelium are good, but not when they're ergot. Ergot is a hallucinogenic fungus, and it was a very common contaminant of rye, especially rye that was harvested during wet harvest periods, and they used it to make dark breads. Could have been a bit of rotten potato, but more likely rye. People also say that this was probably the cause of the issues that were brought to light in the Salem witch trials. Yeah, rotten potato. And there are alternative explanations, of course. Some people felt it might have been from a stroke. Some people thought with his age it might have been dementia. There are other brief psychotic disorders. Marley's been familiar with that. Brain tumor, fever, yep. And it's likely, of all of the different possibilities, it's likely that Tiny Tim suffered from vitamin D deficiency, which is probably due to his family's inadequate and very poor diet. Other possibilities that have been mentioned are rickets, tuberculosis, and those were both common in very poor children in London during the Victorian time period. Polio's been mentioned, but probably not. So how did you all do on the quiz? Did you get some of them? I hope everybody got some. Yeah, infantile paralysis. Well, their terminology is different than ours. But everybody got some. That makes me feel good. So to conclude, Dickens' intention in creating so many characters with disabilities in his stories was to educate his readers and promote social reform and charity toward those with disabilities. Scurvy doesn't have those same symptoms, Tori, but they could definitely have had scurvy. That was one reason a lot of people lost their teeth. Perhaps you're now going to be more aware of disabled characters in Dickens' stories and will be able to determine if he's using them to portray just common, ordinary Victorian attitudes, or if he's using the characters to promote social reform. And I thank you for your attention and turn the mic back to Val.
Thank you so much. That was fascinating, Gentle, to hear about all of the characters and to hear about how Dickens put so much of disabilities in the Victorian era into his literature. So we have time for a couple of questions, and then I am going to get you standing and moving around the Dickens project a bit. But I want to ask you, what stood out to you in Gentle's presentation? Were there any surprises?
For me, the surprise was the disabled house.
Yes. And there's a question for you, Gentle. In doing this research, did you actually read all of Dickens' novels? That was a lot of in-depth research.
Actually, Dickens is not one of my favorite authors. I read a lot of research papers about Dickens' novels.
Yes, I'm sure there's a lot of research out there because he was such a good example of the time period, having lived himself in, working in the blackening factory. His father was sent to a debtor's prison, and he worked as a law clerk in his young life. Next week we will actually have another research project on Dickens and the law. Anything else stand out to you, or any other questions for Gentle? Shiloh's wondering if many disabled people ended up in the debtor's prison, especially with those attitudes that you mentioned, looking down on people with disabilities, even thinking perhaps they were evil or demon-possessed or something like that.
Shiloh, I'm sure that they did, although those records, of course, weren't kept. But as you are aware, once you're put into debtor's prison, you have to pay your debt to get out. And since you're in debtor's prison, you can't work. So hopefully somebody in your family was left outside. But they actually put the wives and young children of the male debtors in the prison with them. I guess that was supposed to be a nice thing, but it wasn't.
May I say this in voice? We I think have a very idealistic view of childhood, because even up through World War II, children sometimes didn't go to school and they had to work. They hawked newspapers, which was common in Dickens' time, I bet, too. But remember when Scrooge, and I typed it, when Scrooge makes that conversion, he throws open the window and he asks the young lad who works at that meat store or something like that. I don't know exactly how you would describe the vendor. And he says, is that big fat turkey or goose still available? And he sends the young boy on an errand to get it. So I think that children, in order to help the parents, or like Dickens, that's what they had to do in order to survive, that they became errand boys back in those days.
So I'm going to stand up and walk towards the door of the warehouse, and I'm going to encourage all of you to follow me outside and take a right. This particular area is the community virtual library area of the Dickens project, but it's actually quite huge, so I encourage you to come back. I'll point out P. Ilios's exhibit room here. That's a medical building. Feel free to walk inside. I'll open the door. When you go in to the left, you'll see her research on medicine in the Victorian era, which goes hand in hand with Gentle's research on disabilities. P. Ilios is a librarian at the University of Puerto Rico, and she has done this research in both English and Spanish. La Medicina en la Época Victoriana. And when you scroll through this, you will find various doctors and medical professionals who helped contribute to medicine during the Victorian times, such as John Snow, a forerunner of modern epidemiology, when cholera broke out in London. I won't go into detail, but you can come back here and look through P's presentation on medicine in the Victorian era. And we'll go further down the lane. We only have a few to look at today, and CVL is archiving the research that we do every year so that we can continue to contribute to the Dickens Project. Feel free to walk inside the great exhibition of 1851, which was the world's first World's Fair at the Crystal Palace, where thousands of people around the globe came to London to share their great inventions and contribute to the explosion of the not the information revolution, that's us today. No, the industrial revolution was happening right then during Dickens' lifetime. And you'll see a research presentation inside that tells about many of those people who came to see the exhibition. If you walk down a little further, on my left is the old Curiosity Shop, a replica from Dickens' work called the Old Curiosity Shop. And if you go inside, you'll see a lot of the interesting items and objects that were written about in the story, The Old Curiosity Shop. Also, right next to the counter are the free costumes that I mentioned. Free Victorian attire. If you don't have a Victorian outfit, you can feel free to go in and get one inside. You can see the Dickens Project strives to be authentic and accurate with the buildings. Have any of you, type a Y in the chat if you've seen the movie that I'm going to type here. It's called The Man Who Invented Christmas. It came out in 2017. It stars Dan Stevens, who played Matthew in Downton Abbey, if you watch that show. Dan Stevens with an S. And it's the story of how Dickens wrote A Christmas Carol. And the reason I bring it up, much of the architecture in The Man Who Invented Christmas will remind you of the Dickens Project. The style of the buildings, the window panes. As we strive in a virtual world to be accurate and authentic, it helps to be able to see pictures and authentic visuals of the time period. And we'll walk up this way. Let's turn to the left and go up the stairs toward the church. If you cam way out, you can see that the Dickens Project is huge. You cannot take it all in today in just one visit. So I highly encourage you to come back and explore. Often there's a horse and carriage. Bay Rum will be rotating around through the sim, and you can hop on and take a horse and carriage ride. Let's walk down this way together. Feel free to take some photos as we're walking along. I do like to mention when I'm talking about accuracy and authority of historical simulations that it's fine to take poetic license, or this is a fantasy experience as well as a literary one, so not everything is going to be perfectly aligned to the Victorian era, but that makes for a great time to talk with students about historical accuracy. Let's walk across this great bridge. And you can stand and take a little view here of the harbor, which is And right underneath us is where we were at the CVL warehouse. You can see it to our left. It's right over here. That's where we all sat. I believe Scrooge's house is very close by. You can look this way, and I like when I'm camming out, you can see the black smoke billowing out of the various buildings as the Industrial Revolution was well underway during Dickens' time period. I did mention that our tour next Wednesday, Dickens and the Law, we'll take another look at some of the stories and the research of Charles Dickens. And if you come back and find the horse and carriage, you can take a nice tour all around to see the various elements. I'm going to stop right here at the tunnel and let you all catch up. The Community Virtual Library has been supporting the Dickens Project since its beginnings. We were both located on the same sim early on, way back when the Dickens Project first began. And since then, every year we strive to add some research projects and support the Dickens Project by bringing people on tours to discuss education in the future. Imagine how students will not simply read the story of A Christmas Carol, nor simply passively view some of the amazing film adaptations and musicals and plays of the story, but they'll be able to actually enter as we are. Enter the book, enter the story, and experience it for yourself as you're discussing it. So many ways to utilize a virtual world for education. Let's walk this way to the farm. If you listen, I hear the chickens clucking. Here we are at a farm right near the Dickens Project. I'm going to peek inside. You can see a beautiful farmhouse done in Victorian style. Does anyone else have any feedback or questions about the Dickens Project or about Gentle's presentation or any of the other research that you think we might want to dig into? One that we have that I'd really like to focus on next year, which is so fun, is a research presentation on the clothing and all the various layers of clothing they wore in those days. The corsets and bustles and petticoats and bodices. And also, how did they clean those? What fabrics were they made out of when they didn't have washing machines and they were walking through the dirty streets of London? I think the clothing would be an interesting research project to talk about. Oh, and Marley, go ahead. The Dickens era music, too.
Right. Val, wasn't there, during the time when Dickens was writing and all that, some observance that the coal pollution was really heavy in the area?
Yes.
Right. They were starting to look at environmental impact, but that also contributed to the short lifespan that people had, especially living in the cities, right?
Absolutely. We did have one research project on that, and it was so dark and dismal with all of that coal and pollution that a lot of people really looked forward to Dickens' installments of his stories as a brief way to escape the poor conditions they were living in. And so that was one reason that contributed to his popularity, was he brought some cheer to their very dark and dismal lives. Yes, I would love to see more on the music of that era and maybe even bring in some recordings. That's a great idea for research. And yes, the schools. A lot of very small, cramped schools, I would imagine, for those children lucky enough to be able to go to school, those that did not have to work hard every day, living in poverty. And we know that the legal system changed some of those very dismal ways of living, but it was a slow process. Thanks for that link, Caledonia, to the great smog of London that you can look at later. I'd like to give a big thank you to Caledonia for the amazing work she does and for allowing us to support it with our research every year. And to Dagmar, who's been very supportive in helping us get our voice going and get us on the calendars. And a big thank you to Gentle Heron for an amazing research project that helps us think about those attitudes towards disabilities in the past that have survived to this very day.